Ladies and gentlemen, are we live? Welcome to my all-new Creepypasta Readings. Today I am presenting Children of Mirth, and if you're wondering why I'm putting so much effort into these videos, well, a dear friend really appreciates them, and she said it looks better when you can see my eyes. Now then, shall we begin? I love horrifying images. Pictures that could make one feel uneasy or even utterly terrified and fascinated. Those delighted me. Yet for all of my appreciation and exposure, they worked their charms exceptionally well on me. I had trouble falling asleep most nights with the visions of these nightmarish things invading my mind and leaving it a smoldering wreck. From horror games to internet screamers to the illustrations of scary stories to tell in the dark, I had a host of things in my head to keep me up at night. I was enthralled and terrified by nearly all of them. The only exceptions were the images that I myself had created. It was March of my junior year in high school, and I loved working with a copy of Photoshop installed on our school laptops. I made photo manipulations relatively often. The only thing they had in common was a complete lack of terror. One day, I decided to change that. I wanted for a long time to test my ability to frighten with imagery. I had already established a reputation as a teller of terrible tales. If anyone ever wanted a good scare, they knew to seek me out. As happy as I was with spreading scary stories, I simply wasn't content to stop there. I wished to expand my horizons as a fright man, and I found a song on my iPod that I'd acquired on a whim months prior, set it to loop, and searched Google for the perfect picture to make my monster. I found it in an image of George Marks. The name wasn't familiar to me, but the picture, with George's gaping smile and his wide eyes, was exactly what I'd been searching for before. It didn't take me long, perhaps 40 minutes at most. I stretched out his mouth, covered his eyes, and put a filter over it all. I was in love. A habit had begun to form like a drug. I became addicted to creating these abominations in Photoshop. I relished the horror of the images I'd made. I showed them around and received similar aghast reactions from every soul to gaze upon them. I relished the ease of which I could make them. Most of all, I relished my absence of fear. I simply had to make more. One image every few months grew into one or two every month, and from there I began making one every week. Before I knew it, I was making one of these images almost every day. As time wore on, I began to refer to these images as my children. I had a folder filled with dozens of them. Dozens of my children, and I loved them dearly. They were macabre, hellish, and utterly delicious. I was barely 20 years old, and I'd left the house and set out from my hometown to live in a larger city a few dozen miles away. I was in school now, college. I had a few good friends, and life was pleasant. The only exceptions were the images I'd created. My infatuation with them began to grow to unsettling heights. Not only did I need to create more of my children, I had to be in contact with them every day. I had a need to be around them. There was a burning emptiness I felt when I wasn't in their presence. I heard faint, incessant whispers in my head while I was away from them. I had to quench this miserable emptiness. The whispers needed to cease. I printed out several of my children and hung them up in my room. Pox of a terrible disease on an otherwise average room. I made more. I cut them out and would make casings for my personal effects. My iPods, my wallet, even my laptop was covered with them. For a small price, I would do the same for others. They became somewhat popular around my university. They thought nothing of my eagerness to perform this service. The consensus was that I was attempting to make a name for myself, and since I was quite skilled at designing these things, no one was the wiser. I would put my children everywhere. They liked the appearance of my work. Now, I can't remember when I would begin muttering. My children had crept further into the recesses of my mind and spoke with my voice. I would ask empty rooms why they weren't laughing. I would ask for people around me to laugh. Sometimes these mutterings would escalate further, leading me to speak or even scream these messages of mirth. Thankfully, I only muttered when I was out and about. People knew I talked to myself for years. For as long as I or anyone else could remember, I muttered and spoke quotes and conversations from movies, television shows, and games. At that point, no one ever bothered to listen to what I was saying. The screaming only occurred on 2 occasions. One went without incident in the middle of the day while everyone was at work or running errands, but one earned me a noise complaint, and I had to explain to a terrified landlord that I was merely having a nightmare. The apartment walls were thick and they all heard the noise. It was not pleasant. There was one unfortunate incident, however. Several of my friends had gathered around. They'd come to my apartment one night to socialize and make merry. We were all having a great time, clanking glasses, having quiet or loud conversations, spilling drinks, and tearing through levels of cartridge-era video games, the sort of things my friends and I customarily did. It was 2:30 in the morning. The celebration had died down, and a few of my friends were passed out on the couch or in the corners of the room. I had none of my children around me. Yet I felt so at ease. Kevin, one of my friends, he hadn't been drinking, so he was on the Super Nintendo. He was destroying a town he built on SimCity and decided to play Yoshi's Island. As he played, I felt myself begin to fade in and out of consciousness. I was rather intoxicated and the night was aging. When he finally got to the piranha plants, however, I became addled. I could see a gaping mouth and an eyeless head that reminded me of George. George was waiting for me. As were all my other children, a single whisper passed my ear before Kevin destroyed the plant. Still, as each plant appeared on the screen, I thought only of my children. My head swam more and more with thoughts of them. I could hear them in my head, begging me to return to them. I was able to keep them at bay for almost an hour before the mumbling began. I blacked out after they started. When I awoke, all my friends were still in the apartment. I was in my room. They were all on my bed, looking at me. The children that were on the walls were torn down, heaped in an ugly pile in a corner of the room. Kevin had a bruise on his neck. I asked what the hell happened, and Kevin explained everything. We had been the only ones awake, and he could understand every word I was saying while I muttered. He was concerned. He was afraid that I'd been talking in my sleep, that I was out of his peripheral vision, and he said he was focusing on the game. But then I vocalized my wishes of laughter. He put the game on pause to stare at me, and I wouldn't be silenced in spite of his requests to stop. Laugh, I begged him. Why aren't you laughing? After a moment of silence, I grabbed him by the throat and at the top of my lungs, I demanded that he laugh. Being stronger than me, he broke free of my grip and restrained me, but I shook and thrashed in the chair for 20 minutes before blacking out. My friends were indeed concerned. They asked if I remembered what I was talking about. I told them about my children. I told them about our mutual need for one another. But they couldn't understand. No one could understand. Of course, they were simply concerned, and while I was restrained, they turned on my computer. They demanded my login information for it, and I begrudgingly divulged it, knowing exactly what they were about to do. They recoiled from my screen as they were greeted by George, who was now my desktop background. They quickly reset George and had him replaced by the default background. I watched as they deleted Mirth, first sending it to the recycle bin and deleting it permanently from the green hills and blue sky that was my new background. I feigned tears, but I wasn't truly concerned. After they finished destroying my children, they begged me to see a psychiatrist. They said if there was another outburst to the previous night, they'd see me into a mental hospital. On that note, they freed me from my restraints. and bade me farewell before leaving. Upholding to my friend's wishes, I looked up a local psychiatrist's office and set up an appointment. I wasn't thrilled in the slightest. I never felt at rest in a psychiatrist's office. I was used to being the quiet, observant one, and a psychiatrist is quiet and observant for a living being. If nothing else, I felt like my mind was being invaded, and they would ask me questions that I did not like. Between the threat on my identity and the feeling of intrusion, I endlessly debated with myself on whether or not to show up for my appointment. Half an hour before the appointment was scheduled, my sense of duty won out. I climbed into my car and made my way to the psych. In the psychiatrist's office, I sat in the reclining chair as Dr. Ridley, or Pauline, if I so desired, began our arduous session by asking me if any previous incidents. I could only remember one. In 8th grade, I was tormented by visions of a small girl in a pink dress. Her straw-like hair dangled in front of her face, and the bits of flesh that clung to her face were completely absent about her mouth. She would chase me, her exposed teeth chomping at me incessantly. And I simply would not die. It always took dozens of stabs for her to finish me off. Her laughter was terrible. I went to counseling, and after a short time the vision stopped. After making some scribbles on a clipboard, the doctor smiled and calmly asked me to explain everything that was going on in my head now. I weaved for her the riveting yarn about my ordeal with my children, and she did exactly as I expected. She sat, nodded, scribbled something down on a clipboard, studied my face, scribbled, nodded, and studied, all the way through my story in a methodical and agonizingly monotonous way. I almost hoped she'd stop me in the middle of my story and ask a few other questions, offer explanations, hell, give me a hug, something. She said that she would research what I've told her and cross-reference any previous existing cases to determine a course of treatment. Almost pleasantly surprised, I smiled and nodded, thanked her, and got the hell out of there, and I drove home. However close to being pleasantly surprised I was still bitterly disappointed. I knew I had a problem. I almost wished she had a solution. Almost. I was still in love with my children. I sorted out the pile of them on the floor and taped them up again. Their blank eyes and their big smiles made me feel so welcome. I opened my computer to be greeted by the hills again, but I smiled and produced a small USB drive from my desk drawer. I plugged it into my computer and opened it, and there it was. Mirth. I would never trust my computer to hold all of my children. What if it crashed? What if it lost them? The folder they deleted had only a fraction of the children I had in this thumb drive. I opened up the folder then and felt so at ease. As I flipped through dozens of the horrors I'd made, I felt more at home than I'd ever felt at any other time. Yet tonight, something felt wrong. Perhaps it was my acknowledgement of my obsession. Perhaps it was the fact that I'd vocalized it, but things seemed to change. The smiles that I'd adored for so long, they grew colder. Their black and white faces glowed unnaturally, and their blank eyes stared into me somehow. I began to feel uneasy as I made my way through the folder. Every so often, my eyes picked up on text that would appear in the middle of the photos. The one phrase that kept repeating was, "Why, Father? Why, Father?" The more I scrolled and browsed my children, the more my blood began to chill and my skin began to crawl. Other texts began to appear. "We loved you. We trusted you. Father, love us," popped up with increasing frequency, all of them. I don't know why I kept scrolling. I felt like I was tumbling down a spiraled staircase and there was no way out. I could only stop when I reached the very bottom. And the last photo in that folder was of me. It was amazing. It was in full color. My eyes were sewn shut and my jaw stretched far below my neck. My lips were peeled back in mirth to expose long, discolored teeth. It was beautiful, brilliantly executed, and it made me scream. I didn't make this. I didn't. I'm not sure what happened after that. The line between reality and delusion blurred. My mind completely derailed. The photo on screen twisted and contorted at grotesque angles and in inhuman fashions. "Love us again!" it shouted. In a tremulous, inhuman voice, I fell out of my chair, wailing. I landed on my back and stared at my walls, and all of my children stared down and laughed. In unison, they all began to chant. "We do not love you anymore, Father. Why aren't you laughing?" They bellowed. They laughed and screeched, and their blank eyes ripped open to drip blood onto my face. Their faces drew closer and closer to mine. I knew it had to be a psychotic delusion, but was it? How could I be so sure? I scratched at my face madly before digging my fingers into the sockets to plug my eyes out. And then I awoke. There were no screams now, only whispers. I could still hear my children whispering to me. Their voices slipped into my ears ever so gently. "We don't love you. You should be laughing. Laugh, Father." I laid in wretched agony for what could have passed for an eternity. I went to rub my eyes before I realized they were still in my palms. I chuckled as I tossed them out of my hands. I'm not sure when my neighbor had come into the room. He was a middle-aged widower that usually wasn't home. I have no idea why he came. I felt his eyes burn with agonized concern. He murmured uncontrollably, begging to know what I had done, why I had done all of it. All the things a typical caring bystander would ask. What life I had left now was going to be miserable, dark, and cold. The only exceptions were the images I'd created. I smiled. I leapt up and grabbed him by the neck, choking the life from his body, as I whispered through a mirthless grin, "Why not laugh, child? Why aren't you laughing?" And I laughed, mirthfully.